The dust of the main street in Redemption was the color of old bone. It coated everything, a fine powder of forgotten promises that settled on the hem of Opal's dress, in the lines of her hands, on the lashes of her downcast eyes. She stood beside the wagon, a statue of worn gray wool, while her sons completed the transaction. Jed the elder would not meet her gaze. His jaw was set, his focus entirely on the stack of coins Mr. Fletcher was counting onto the lip of a pickle barrel. Thomas, the younger, kept glancing at her, his face a miserable mix of guilt and weak resolve. He was the one who had cried when their father passed. Now he was selling his mother. "The debt is paid," Mr. Fletcher said, his voice thick and satisfied, like a man finishing a heavy meal. He slid the coins into a leather pouch that cinched with a sound of finality. "She's mine now," as agreed, "to work off the rest of what you boys owe in room and board at my store." He didn't say her name. He didn't have to. She was no longer a person with a name. She was an asset, a line item in a ledger, a debt paid in flesh. Jed finally looked at her, his eyes hard. "You'll have a roof, Ma. Food. It's more than we could give." It was a justification, not an apology. A lie he told himself so he could sleep. Thomas just looked away, his shoulders slumped. Opal felt a cold, hollow space open up in her chest. A place where 40 years of love and sacrifice had been carved out and discarded. She had birthed them, nursed them through fevers, mended their clothes and their scraped knees, buried their father, and held the failing farm together with nothing but grit and prayer. And for a debt of whiskey and credit at the general store, they had sold her. Fletcher's hand clamped onto her arm, his fingers digging into the thin muscle. He was a portly man, sweating through his waistcoat despite the dry air. He smelled of salted meat and cheap cigars. "Come along," he grunted, pulling her toward the mercantile. The word "owned" echoed in the silence of her mind. The townsfolk who had paused to watch the scene turned away, pretending to be busy with their own affairs. No one wanted to witness this. No one wanted to intervene. It was a private matter, a debt. And in Redemption, debts were sacred. As Fletcher dragged her toward the covered porch of his store, her gaze snagged on a man standing across the street by the blacksmith's forge. He was tall and lean, dressed in buckskin and worn denim. His stillness a stark contrast to the town's nervous shuffle, a mountain man by the look of him. His hair was dark and long, his face weathered by sun and wind. He wasn't staring at her with the pity or morbid curiosity of the others. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, were fixed on the transaction, on Fletcher's hand on her arm, with an unnerving, quiet intensity. For a fleeting second, their eyes met. She saw no judgment, no condemnation, just a deep, still watchfulness. Then he turned, lifted a heavy sack of grain to his shoulder as if it were nothing, and walked toward a mule tied to a hitching post. His movements economical and sure. He didn't look back. The mercantile smelled of coffee beans, kerosene, and dust. Fletcher shoved her toward a door at the back. "Your room's in there, small, but it's dry. You'll start at dawn, sweeping, stocking. Whatever I tell you." Understood. Opal nodded, her throat too tight to form words. The door opened into a windowless closet, barely big enough for a narrow cot and a crate for a table. It was a cage. He shut the door behind her, and the bolt slid home with a heavy, metallic thud. The sound of her old life ending, the sound of her new one beginning. She sank onto the lumpy mattress, the dust motes dancing in the single sliver of light under the door, and did not cry. Tears were a luxury for women who still had something left to lose. The days that followed blurred into a gray smear of endless labor. Opal rose before the sun, her hands raw from lye soap and splintered crates. She swept the floors, polished the long wooden counter until it gleamed, weighed out flour and sugar for the town's women, who spoke to her in clipped, cautious tones or ignored her altogether. She was Fletcher's property now, a thing to be pitied or scorned. He was always watching, his presence a heavy weight on her shoulders. He'd brush against her in the narrow aisles, his touch lingering too long. He'd make comments about her sons getting the better end of the bargain. Each word, each touch, was a new layer of grime she couldn't wash off. Her sons she saw only from a distance. They worked odd jobs around town. their faces perpetually turned away from the mercantile. They were ghosts to her now, haunting the edges of her vision. Once, Thomas started to walk toward the store as she was sweeping the porch, his face etched with a familiar sorrow. But Jed grabbed his arm and pulled him back, shaking his head. They crossed the street, disappearing into the saloon. The broom felt heavy in her hands, each sweep a whisper of their names: Jed, Thomas. The sound was like ash in her mouth. A week into her servitude, the mountain man came back. The bell above the door chimed, a sharp, clean sound in the stuffy air. He moved with a quiet that seemed to take up more space than noise. He set a stack of tanned beaver pelts on the counter. They were perfect. They're for thick and dark. Fletcher's eyes lit with greed as he ran his hands over them. Calloway, Fletcher said, his voice suddenly slick with false charm. Good to see you. Prime pelts, prime. The mountain man, Calloway, just nodded. His gaze swept the store, cool and assessing, and then it found her. She was arranging tins of peaches on a high shelf, her arms aching. He didn't smile. Didn't offer any sign of recognition, but his eyes held hers for a moment longer than was necessary. It felt like being seen, truly seen, not as Fletcher's drudge or the town's cautionary tale, but as a woman's standing on a stool with tired arms. Need flour, Calloway said, his voice a low rumble like rocks shifting deep in the earth. And coffee, salt. He listed his needs without looking at Fletcher, his attention still on her. Fletcher, oblivious, began weighing out the goods. The woman will get it, he said with a wave of his hand. Opal climbed down from the stool, her knees stiff. She moved to the barrels, her hands scooping flour into a sack, the fine white powder dusting her already worn dress. She could feel Calloway's eyes on her back. It wasn't a leering gaze like Fletcher's. It was something else, attentive, still. It made the hairs on her arms stand up. She tied the sack and placed it on the counter next to the others. Calloway pushed the pelts forward. This should cover it. Fletcher nodded eagerly, already calculating his profit. As Calloway gathered his supplies, his hand brushed hers. It was an accident, a brief contact of calloused skin against her own, but a jolt went through her, sharp and unexpected. It was the first human touch in a week that wasn't a shove or a grab. He pulled his hand back as if burned, his jaw tightening. He loaded his goods into a burlap sack, slung it over his shoulder, and left without another word. The bell chimed his departure, and the silence he left behind was heavier than the one he had entered. Life settled back into its grim rhythm, but something had shifted in Opal. That brief moment of contact, the feeling of his steady gaze, had planted a tiny seed of something that was not despair. It was a foolish thing to hold on to, a mountain man's accidental touch, but it was all she had. She found herself watching the street, listening for the jingle of the bell, waiting for him to return. One afternoon, a panic erupted outside. A woman screamed. Opal rushed to the doorway to see Sarah Miller, the doctor's wife, frantic. Her little boy, Timmy, had been playing near the livery, and a spooked horse had kicked out, catching him in the chest. He lay on the ground, pale and still, a terrible, shallow rasping sound coming from his throat. Dr. Miller came running, his face ashen. He knelt beside his son, his hands trembling as he tried to find a pulse. The boy's face was turning a dusky blue. He's choking on his own blood, the doctor gasped. His medical knowledge useless in the face of his own terror. His lung, I think it's collapsed. A crowd gathered, helpless and horrified. Fletcher stood on the porch, wringing his hands, offering useless platitudes. Opal pushed through the onlookers. She had seen this once before, years ago when a farmhand fell from a hayloft. Let me see, she said, her voice quiet but firm. Dr. Miller looked up, his eyes wild with grief. What can you do? He choked out. You're just, he trailed off, unable to finish the insult. Opal ignored him, kneeling beside the boy. She saw the unnatural shape of his chest, the way one side didn't rise with his struggling breaths. She knew what had to be done. It was a desperate, dangerous folk remedy, something her grandmother had taught her, a last resort when God had turned his back. I need a needle, she said, looking at the women in the crowd. A big one, a darning needle, and whiskey. Someone ran to the mercantile, someone else to the saloon. Fletcher started to protest. What do you think you're doing? You'll kill him. But Opal's focus was absolute. She ripped a clean strip of cloth from her petticoat. The needle and whiskey arrived. She sterilized the needle in the harsh liquid. Her hands steady. She felt for the space between the boy's ribs. Her fingers pressing gently, she found the spot, just as her grandmother had shown her. She whispered a silent prayer. Then, with a swift, sure movement, she pushed the needle into his chest. A collective gasp went through the crowd. A hiss of air escaped from the wound, a foul, trapped breath, and then, miraculously, Timmy's small chest rose, this time evenly. He took a shuddering, deep breath, and the blue tinge began to recede from his lips. Color flooded back into his face. He coughed, then began to cry. A weak but living sound. Dr. Miller stared, his mouth agape. He fell to his knees, gathering his son into his arms, weeping with relief. The crowd murmured in astonishment. They looked at Opal no longer with pity or scorn, but with a new, grudging respect. She had done what the doctor could not. She had saved the boy's life. And standing at the edge of the crowd, leaning against the wall of the blacksmith shop, was Calloway. He had seen the whole thing. He wasn't looking at the boy. He was looking at her, and this time the expression on his weathered face was unmistakable. It was awe. Fletcher grabbed her arm, his face a mask of fury. "Get back inside." "You think this makes you special? You're still mine." He tried to drag her back into the store, but a low voice stopped him. "Let her be." It was Calloway. He hadn't moved from his spot, hadn't raised his voice, but the command cut through the air like a blade. Fletcher froze, his grip tightening on Opal's arm. He turned, his face mottled with rage. "This is my business, Calloway. Keep your nose out of it." Calloway pushed off from the wall and walked toward them. He moved with a predator's grace, silent and deliberate. He stopped a few feet away, his stormy eyes fixed on Fletcher's hand. "I said," he repeated, his voice dropping even lower, "let her be." There was no threat of violence in his tone, but something far more potent. It was a statement of absolute certainty, a promise of consequences that Fletcher could feel in his bones. The storekeeper's bluster evaporated. He looked from Calloway's impassive face to the watching eyes of the townspeople, who were now looking at him with open contempt. Slowly, reluctantly, he released Opal's arm. Calloway gave a slight nod, a gesture of acknowledgement that was almost imperceptible. He turned without another word and walked back to his mule. He hadn't rescued her, not really. He had simply drawn a line in the dust. A line Fletcher was too cowardly to cross, at least for now. Opal watched him go, her arm tingling where Fletcher's fingers had been, her heart pounding a strange, unsteady rhythm. She had proven her worth to the town. But it was Calloway's quiet defense that resonated deep in her soul, a silent promise that she was not entirely alone. The incident with the doctor's son changed things. The townswoman now met her eye. They would ask her quiet questions when Fletcher wasn't looking. "My girl has a cough that won't quit, Opal. What's good for it? My husband's hand is festering from a splinter. Is there a poultice you know?" She would tell them what she knew, sharing the simple wisdom of herbs and remedies passed down through generations. She became a quiet source of healing, a secret resource for a town with a doctor who was more comfortable with books than with people. It gave her a fragile sense of purpose, a dignity that Fletcher's ownership could not entirely erase. Fletcher hated it. He saw the respect in the town's eyes, and it infuriated him. She was his property, his drudge. Her newfound status was a challenge to his authority. He doubled her work, found fault in everything she did, his verbal abuse growing sharper and more frequent. He was determined to break her, to remind her and the town of her place. Calloway began coming to town more often. Every few days, the bell above the door would jingle, and he would be there, a silent, watchful presence. He never bought much. A little tobacco, some coffee, a handful of nails. He would always wait until she was free to serve him, ignoring Fletcher's impatient glares. He spoke little, but his questions were always for her. "The willow bark?" he asked one day, his voice low. "For a headache?" "Yes," she'd replied, her voice barely a whisper. "Chew it, or make a tea." He'd nodded, his gaze lingering on her face. These small exchanges were lifelines. He was the only person who acknowledged her skill, the only one who spoke to her as an equal. The space between them crackled with unspoken things. It was a dangerous, hopeful current that she both feared and craved. One blustery afternoon in late autumn, Fletcher sent her to gather firewood from the woodpile behind the store. A sudden storm rolled in from the mountains, the sky turning a bruised purple. The wind howled, tearing at her thin shawl, and a cold, driving rain began to fall. The woodpile was nearly empty. She would have to go to the edge of the woods, where fallen branches were plentiful. She hesitated, looking at the dark, thrashing trees, but the thought of Fletcher's anger was worse than the storm. She pulled her shawl tighter and hurried toward the tree line. The rain came down in sheets, soaking her to the bone in seconds. The wind was a physical force pushing her, blinding her with rain and flying leaves. She gathered a few meager branches, her hands numb with cold, shivering. She took shelter in the lee of a great granite boulder, a small overhang providing a sliver of protection. She huddled against the cold stone, her teeth chattering, wondering how long she would have to wait. The world was a gray blur of rain and noise. A figure emerged from the deluge, moving through the trees with an easy, familiar stride. It was Calloway. He carried a rifle in one hand and a brace of rabbits in the other. He stopped when he saw her, his expression unreadable. He didn't seem surprised to find her there. He came to the outcropping, the water streaming from his hat and long coat. He didn't speak. He simply shrugged off his heavy oilskin coat, the one that smelled of pine and wood smoke, and him, and draped it over her shoulders. The warmth of it was immediate, a shocking comfort against her frozen skin. It was heavy, a solid, protective weight. She pulled it tighter, inhaling the scent of him, feeling a blush of heat rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the cold. They stood in silence for a long time, side by side under the rock, listening to the storm rage around them. The shared silence was more intimate than any conversation. In his presence, the howling wind seemed less menacing. She felt a profound sense of safety she hadn't realized she'd been missing until that very moment. It was more than just shelter from the rain. It was a shelter from the world. When the rain finally eased to a steady drizzle, he spoke. "I'll walk you back." She nodded, unable to find her voice. She started to shrug off his coat, but he put a hand on her shoulder to stop her. "Keep it. You'll catch your death." His touch was brief, his fingers firm and warm through the thick fabric, but it sent another tremor through her. They walked back to the edge of town without a word. The muddy ground sucked at her worn shoes. When they reached the back of the mercantile, the lights were on inside. She could see Fletcher's silhouette pacing back and forth. The fear returned, cold and sharp. She handed the coat back to Calloway. "Thank you," she whispered. He took it, his eyes searching her face in the gray twilight. He seemed about to say something, but then he just gave a curt nod and melted back into the woods. Opal slipped inside, her heart a confusion of gratitude and dread. The warmth of his coat lingered on her skin long after he was gone. Fletcher was waiting for her, his face livid. "Where have you been?" Gallivanting in the woods. He grabbed the few wet sticks from her arms and threw them to the floor. Useless. Utterly useless. His eyes narrowed. "You were with him, weren't you?" "That mountain savage." "It was raining," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "I took shelter." "Liar," he spat. "I see the way he looks at you, the way you look at him. You think you're too good for me now? You think he's going to save you?" He stepped closer, backing her against the wall. His sour breath washed over her. "Let me remind you what you are. Opal, you are a debt my property, and it's past time I could collect it." The threat hung in the air, ugly and explicit. He didn't touch her, not then. He just smiled, a cruel, triumphant curl of his lip. "Tomorrow," he said softly, "the town has a barn raising for the new preacher. Everyone will be there, busy. We'll have the place to ourselves. We'll settle accounts." He turned and walked away, leaving her standing there, the cold seeping back into her bones, a cold that Calloway's coat could no longer ward off. The next day dawned with a pitiless, clear sky. The whole town was alive with the sounds of hammers and saws, their cheerful industry a mocking counterpoint to the terror that was closing in on Opal. She moved through her morning chores in a fog of dread. Every slam of a hammer felt like a nail in her coffin. Fletcher watched her, a smug, possessive look in his eyes. He hummed as he worked, a tuneless, grating sound. By midday, the streets were nearly empty. The sounds of the barn raising drifted from the edge of town, a distant celebration of community she was no longer part of. Fletcher locked the front door of the mercantile, sliding the heavy bar across. The sound echoed in the empty store. "There," he said, turning to her with that same ugly smile. Nice and private. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. Her mind raced, searching for an escape. The back room, the small high window. It was impossible. He began to walk toward her, slowly, savoring her fear. Time to pay what's owed, Opal. This was it, the moment she had been dreading. But as he reached for her, something inside her, a core of iron that had been forged in hardship and grief, refused to break. She was not a debt. She was not property. She was Opal, a woman who had survived the death of a husband, the betrayal of her sons, the scorn of a town. She would not be collected like a coin. She dodged his grasp, grabbing a heavy iron skillet from the pot-bellied stove. She held it in front of her, a makeshift shield. "Stay back," she warned, her voice low and trembling, but full of a resolve that surprised them both. He laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "A little fire in you after all. I'll enjoy putting it out." He lunged. She swung the skillet, catching him on the side of the head with a sickening clang. He staggered back, his hand flying to his temple, his eyes wide with shock and pain. He roared with fury and came at her again, knocking the skillet from her hand. He grabbed her, his fingers biting into her arms, and threw her to the floor. He stood over her, breathing heavily, a trickle of blood running from his hairline. The smile was gone, replaced by pure rage. "You'll pay for that," he snarled. He reached down for her, and she scrambled backward, crab walking away from him until her back hit the base of the counter. She was trapped. She closed her eyes, a silent prayer forming on her lips. Suddenly, the front door of the mercantile crashed open, the heavy bar splintering from its brackets. The doorway was filled by the silhouette of a man, Calloway. He stood there for a moment, his eyes taking in the scene, Fletcher standing over her, the overturned skillet, the terror on her face. His expression, usually so placid, was transformed into something cold and lethal. Fletcher spun around, his face paling. "Calloway, this is private property. You have no right." Calloway didn't speak. He moved into the room, his steps silent on the wooden floor. He walked past the counter, past the barrels of flour and nails, his focus entirely on Fletcher. The storekeeper took a step back, then another. He was a bully, strong when his victim was weak, but a coward in the face of true strength. "She's mine," Fletcher blustered, his voice cracking. "I have the bill of sale, her son's." Calloway stopped directly in front of him. He was taller than Fletcher and leaner, but he seemed to take up all the air in the room. "A woman is not a debt to be collected," he said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of a death sentence. He raised a hand, not to strike, but simply placed it on Fletcher's chest. He pushed. It wasn't a violent shove, but it was irresistible. Fletcher stumbled backward, tripping over a crate and crashing to the floor in a heap of flailing limbs and outraged dignity. Calloway didn't spare him another glance. He turned to Opal, who was still huddled on the floor. He knelt down, his movements slow and gentle, as if approaching a frightened animal. He held out a hand. "Opal." It was the first time she had heard him say her full name. It sounded different in his mouth, solid, real. She looked at his hand, large, calloused, and steady. After a moment's hesitation, she placed her trembling hand in his. His fingers closed round hers, warm and strong, and he helped her to her feet. He didn't let go. He led her out of the store, past the spluttering, humiliated form of Fletcher, and into the bright sunlight. The sounds of the barn raising seemed to stop. People had seen the door crash open. They had seen Calloway go inside. Now they saw him emerge, holding her hand. They saw the blood on Fletcher's head as he staggered to the doorway, shouting threats and curses. The townspeople gathered, their faces a mixture of shock and curiosity. Dr. Miller was there, and his wife, Sarah. Her sons, Jed and Thomas, stood at the back of the crowd, their faces pale with shame. Fletcher pointed a shaking finger at them. "She attacked me." "She's my property, ask her sons. They sold her to me fair and square." All eyes turned to Opal and then to Calloway. This was the moment of reckoning. The law was on Fletcher's side. A bill of sale was a binding document. She had no rights, no standing. She felt a wave of despair wash over her. Calloway had saved her from the moment, but not from the reality of her situation. She was still owned. Calloway felt her tremble. He squeezed her hand, a silent message of reassurance. He turned to face the crowd, his gaze sweeping over their faces. He was not a man of many words. He did not make speeches, but when he spoke, the entire town listened. "He's right," Calloway said, his voice clear and calm, carrying across the dusty street. "There is a debt." A murmur went through the crowd. Fletcher's face split into a triumphant grin. "But the debt is mine to settle." He reached into his worn leather pouch and pulled out a small, heavy deerskin bag. He tossed it to Fletcher. It landed with a heavy clink of gold coin. "That's for her bill of sale. And for the damage to your door. You will write out a receipt saying she is free and clear, and you will never speak her name again." Fletcher stared at the bag, his greed warring with his humiliation. It was more than she was worth. More than he could have made from her in a decade of labor. But it wasn't enough. He wanted her. He wanted his power back. "It's not enough," he spat. "She's not for sale." Calloway's eyes narrowed. She was never for sale. He then turned to face the entire town, his hand still holding Opal's. He drew her slightly closer to his side, a protective, possessive gesture that was also deeply tender. "And you will not speak of her as such. Because she is not your concern, she is mine." He paused, letting his words sink in. "Opal is my wife." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. The statement was so bald, so unexpected, it stunned them into silence. "My wife." The words echoed in the sudden quiet. It was a lie, of course. But it was a lie that changed everything. A wife had a name, a wife had protection, a wife was not property. He had given her the only thing he had that could truly save her, his name. Fletcher's face turned purple with rage. "Your wife? You're lying." "There's been no preacher, no ceremony." "That," Calloway said, his voice dropping to a dangerous low, "is between me, her and God. And it is not for you to question." He looked toward the new preacher, a young, earnest man, standing stunned by the half-finished barn. "Preacher. Is a man's word before God and his community not a binding thing?" The preacher, flustered, could only nod. "Yes, Mr. Calloway, it is." Calloway turned his gaze on Jed and Thomas. They flinched as if struck. "Your mother," he said, the words like stones, "will be coming with me. You will not follow. You will not trouble her again." He didn't need to raise his voice. The command was absolute. Thomas burst into tears, a great, gulping sob of shame. Jed just stared at the ground, his face white. They had sold their mother for a handful of coins. This quiet mountain man had just bought her freedom with gold, and then given her the ultimate protection, the one thing they had stolen from her. A place in the world. Without another word, Calloway led Opal toward his mule, which stood patiently at the hitching post. The crowd parted for them like water around a rock. He lifted her onto the animal's back, his hands gentle and sure at her waist. He swung up behind her, his body a solid, warm shield at her back. He picked up the reins, and with a soft click of his tongue, they started to move. They rode out of Redemption, leaving behind the splintered door, the bag of gold, the stunned silence, and the wreckage of Opal's old life. As they cleared the last building, she didn't look back. She leaned against the solid strength of the man who had given her his name, and for the first time in a very long time, she felt the quiet, unfamiliar stirrings of hope. The ride up the mountain was silent. The trail was narrow, winding through dense stands of pine and aspen. The air grew cooler, cleaner, smelling of damp earth and pine needles. Opal was keenly aware of Calloway's presence behind her. His chest was a warm, solid wall against her back. His arms were on either side of her, his hands steady on the reins. She could feel the rhythm of his breathing. It was a strange and unsettling intimacy, but not an unwelcome one. After the terror of the day, his quiet strength was a balm. His cabin was nestled in a small meadow high on the mountain, with a view that stretched out over the entire valley. It was a simple, sturdy structure of hand-hewn logs, with a stone chimney sending a thin curl of smoke into the sky. A small, well-tended garden grew beside it, and a lean-to held a neat stack of firewood. It was a place of solitude and order. It was his home. He slid off the mule first, then reached up to help her down. His hands spanned her waist, and he lowered her to the ground with an ease that spoke of immense strength. For a moment, they stood facing each other, the space between them charged with all the things that had not been said. His stormy eyes searched her face. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice rough. She nodded, her throat tight. "You saved my life." A muscle worked in his jaw. "Fletcher's a coward. He wouldn't have killed you." "There are things worse than dying," she whispered. And she saw in his eyes that he understood. He knew exactly what he had saved her from. He led her inside. The cabin was one room, dominated by a large stone fireplace. A rough-hewn table and two chairs sat in the center. A bed, neatly made with wool blankets, was tucked into one corner. Shelves lined the walls, holding tins, jars, and a few worn books. Everything was clean, sparse, and functional. It was the home of a man who lived alone and was content with it. "It's not much," he said, his voice betraying a hint of something that might have been apology. "It's safe," she replied, and that was everything. He set about building up the fire, his movements efficient. Opal stood awkwardly in the center of the room, unsure of her place. She was his wife, in name. But what did that mean here, in this quiet cabin on this lonely mountain? Was she his housekeeper, his prisoner, his partner? He seemed to sense her unease. "The bed is yours," he said, not looking at her. "I'll take my bedroll by the fire." He gestured to a rolled-up canvas bundle near the hearth. His meaning was clear. He had given her his name for protection, not possession. He was offering her sanctuary, not demanding a husband's rights. The relief that washed over her was so profound it made her dizzy. In the days that followed, they settled into a quiet rhythm. He would leave at dawn to check his trap lines or hunt, and she would tend to the cabin. She found a surprising peace in the simple chores. She cooked meals on the hearth, mended his worn shirts, and explored the small herb garden he kept. She found chamomile and yarrow, plants she knew well and others she did not. It felt good to have her hands in the earth again. He rarely spoke, but his actions were a language all their own. One morning she woke to find he had built a new set of shelves for her beside the hearth, a place for her to dry her herbs. He hadn't asked. He had just seen the need and filled it. Another evening, he returned with a handful of wild bluebells and set them in a tin cup on the table. He said nothing, just placed them there and turned to clean his rifle. But the small splash of color brightened the entire room. She, in turn, found ways to care for him. She saved him a hot plate of stew when he returned late, cold and weary from the mountain. She noticed he had a deep, hacking cough that he tried to hide, and she began brewing him a tea of mullein and honey. At first, he regarded the steaming mug with suspicion, but he drank it, and slowly the cough began to ease. They were two solitary people circling each other in the small space of the cabin, learning a new language of quiet gestures. One night, a storm blew in, rattling the windows and howling down the chimney. Calloway sat by the fire, sharpening a knife on a whetstone, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone the only sound besides the wind. Opal sat at that table, mending a tear in one of his blankets. The silence stretched, comfortable and deep. "Why did you do it?" she asked suddenly, the question that had been sitting on her heart for weeks. He stopped his work, the silence now ringing with her words. He looked into the fire, his profile etched by the flickering light. "I know what it is to have something stolen from you," he said, his voice low and rough with memory. "I had a wife and a daughter. A fever took them both one winter years ago, down in the valley. The doctor was drunk, the preacher offered prayers. Nobody did a damn thing." He set the knife and stone aside, his big hands resting on his knees. "I saw Fletcher lay his hands on you, and I saw a man claiming a thing that wasn't his to claim. I saw them all watch and do nothing, and I couldn't do nothing again. The confession hung in the air between them, a piece of his broken heart laid bare. This was his damage, the guilt he carried. He hadn't just failed to save his own family. He felt he had failed to act. Saving her was his penance. His rescue of her was also a rescue of himself, from the man he had become in the wake of his grief. A man who did nothing. She left her chair and went to him, kneeling on the hearth rug beside him. She didn't say anything. She simply reached out and placed her hand on his, her fingers covering his knuckles. He flinched at the touch, but he did not pull away. He turned his hand over and laced his fingers with hers. His grip was strong, desperate, the grip of a drowning man finding a raft. They sat like that for a long time, watching the fire, their joined hands a silent promise in the stormy night. The wall he had built around himself had finally cracked, and she was the one who had found her way inside. The mountain healed her, the clean air, the hard work, the profound quiet. It all served to wash away the grime of redemption. But it was Calloway's presence that truly mended her spirit. The way he watched her, as if she were something precious. The way he had started to talk to her, telling her small things about the mountain, the names of the birds, the best places to find wild onions. He was a man who had closed himself off from the world, and now, slowly, carefully, he was letting her in. One afternoon, as she was returning from the creek with buckets of water, she saw him standing at the edge of the meadow. Watching the valley below, she came to stand beside him. Redemption was a smudge of smoke and rooftops far below them. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked softly. Being around people, he was quiet for a long moment. "I didn't think I did," he said, his gaze still on the valley. "This mountain, it was enough. But it's a quiet place. Sometimes the quiet gets loud." He turned to look at her, and his eyes were full of a raw, aching vulnerability she had never seen before. "It's not so loud anymore. Since you've been here." His words were a declaration, more powerful than any flowery poem. He was saying he needed her, not just for the mending and the cooking, but for the company. For the way her presence filled the empty spaces in his home and in his heart. He reached out, his calloused thumb gently tracing the line of her jaw. His touch was hesitant, questioning. She leaned into it, a silent answer. The distance that had separated them for weeks, the distance between the foot of the bed and the fireside bedroll, vanished in an instant. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion, but of profound tenderness. It tasted of wood smoke and sorrow and a deep, slow-burning hope. It was a promise, a beginning. When he pulled away, he rested his forehead against hers. "Opal," he breathed, his voice thick with emotion. "My name is the only thing I had to give. I want it to be yours." For real, tears welled in her eyes. Tears not of sorrow, but of a joy so deep it hurt. "Yes," she whispered, "Calloway, yes." They were married by the young preacher a week later. Not in the church in town, but in their meadow on the mountain, with the pines as their witnesses and the vast blue sky as their cathedral roof. It was a simple ceremony, just a few quiet words and a promise. But for Opal, it was the end of a long, dark road and the start of a new life. She was no longer a debt, no longer property, no longer a ghost haunting the edges of a town that had discarded her. She was Opal Calloway. She was home. The final image of her old life came a few months later. Calloway had gone to town for supplies, and Opal, feeling brave, had gone with him. She sat on the mule, waiting, while he went into the new mercantile, the one that had opened across the street from Fletcher's now struggling business. As she waited, she saw her sons, Jed and Thomas. They were loading crates onto a wagon, their faces thin, their clothes worn. They looked beaten down by the life they had chosen. Jed saw her and quickly looked away, his face hardening with shame. But Thomas met her gaze. He raised a hand in a hesitant, sorrowful wave. Opal looked at him, at the boy she had raised, the boy who had sold her. She felt a pang of the old grief, the mother's ache for a lost child. But it was distant now, a scar instead of an open wound. She gave him a small, sad nod of acknowledgement, a gesture of forgiveness and farewell. Then she turned her face toward the mountain, her mountain, where her husband was walking toward her, his arms full of provisions, his face breaking into a rare true smile when he saw her. He had saved her from a debt she did not owe, and she had saved him from a solitude that was killing him. They had rescued each other, and as they rode back up the trail, leaving the bone dust town behind, she knew with a certainty that settled deep in her soul that the best parts of her life were just beginning. The frontier was still a wild and dangerous place, but she had found her shelter, her home, her name. She had found it in the heart of a quiet mountain man.